Nirasya sarva sandeham ekikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram Nama shrestam manumapi shachiputramatra swarupam Rupam tasyagrajamurupurim maturim gushtavatim Radha kundam girivaramaho radhikamadavasham Prapto yasya pratita kripaya Shri Gurum tam natosmi Vancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyaiva cha Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah Namo mahavaranyaya Krishna prema pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kudari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Siva Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Adadanastinam Jancher Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambhojo Julisyam Janma Janmani. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, steeped in fulfilling his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Today, we begin a series of classes on the Padyavali, the compilation of the verses in praise of Krishna, Krishna Bhakti, Krishna Lila, and so forth, by Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. So, first I'm going to introduce the text a little bit, and then we'll discuss the first verse where Rupa Goswami himself gives an introduction to the text. So I'm introducing the introduction first. So Rupa Goswami needs no introduction. I think we're all acquainted with his preeminent position within the Gaudiya firmament, if you will, how he is praised by Thakur Mahashai for, in the phrase, Sri Chaitanya Mano Bhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Karamadhyam Dadati Svaparantikam. When shall I be given a place at the lotus feet of Sri Rupa Goswami, he by whom the desired object of Mahaprabhu's heart has been established here in the world? And what is that manobhishta, or that desired object of the heart? Then Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad, in his commentary on the Prem Bhakti Chandrika, he says that that desired object is Bhakti Rasa Grantha, is these texts that present or teach and enable the persons to have the experience of Bhakti Rasa. So it was Bhakti Rasa that Mahaprabhu himself, meaning Brajendra Nandan Sri Krishna himself, descended to relish, and not only relish himself, but also teach the path by which blessed jivas could also have experience of that as well. So Rupa Goswami Pad has highlighted this in the verse he gives, Anarpita charim chirat karunaya vatirna kalu samarpayitum unatujjala rasam. So bhakti shriyam, that he has come to give this treasure of bhakti to himself, and that in general as well as to the highest specific degree, meaning this unata ujjala rasa, this most exalted or elevated, meaning pristine expression of ujjala rasa or madhura rasa, found in Vrindavan, found among the Brajagopis, found ultimately in Srimati Radharani. So, and in the service rendered to her. So Mahaprabhu himself descended to relish Radharani's prem, the beauty of himself that is only able to be perceived through the lens of that prem, and the bliss that's felt through the perception of himself by means of that prem. And in doing so, he also, in essence, laid down the path by which others could also render service to Srimati Radharani and have become so steeped in a oneness of heart with her that some experience of that bhav within her heart could also be transmitted to theirs. So this Padyavali is one of the early works of Rupa Goswami, where he went about fulfilling that order of Mahaprabhu, or which has contributed to the fulfillment of that. And it presents the initial 100 plus verses deal with, you could say, general topics, the greatness of bhajan in general, the greatness of the name of Krishna, things like this. And then the later verses deal more with different features of Krishna's Leela, and in particular his Leela with the gopis. So it covers quite a wide range of topics, and it's organized by topics. So there's many, many very charming expressions found herein, which are which leave their mark in the mind, or which can spark sustained and enriching contemplation. So I'll say a little bit more about that later, but this is, broadly speaking, the position of the Padyavali within the broader, Gaudiya world, if you will. So I'd like to just say a few technical things, that the sources I'm using here for this discussion are the edition of the Padyavali. I'm using a few editions. One, there's a well-known critical edition, which was published by Sushil Kumar Dey from Dhaka University in 1934, or somewhere in the 1930s. And he was quite a prolific scholar of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and some of his works are still frequently referred to within academic writing on Gaudiya Vaishnavism today. And among the different books that he published, one was a critical edition of the Padyavali, where he collected, I think it was 16 different manuscripts from different libraries and other scholars and descendants of Nityananda Prabhu, Advaita Prabhu, other prominent persons of his era, and he prepared this critical edition of the text. And so that's a very useful source. I'm using that as my source for the Mool text. So then all the discussion of variants, one can just collect all that from the critical edition. But the critical edition has no translation. It's just the Sanskrit itself with variants and discussion of different readings or references to different sources from which the verses are collected, etc. So as far as translations, I'm using two sources. One is the translation by Ramnarayan Vidyaratna, which was then edited later by a later scholar who also worked at the Radharaman Yantra, which is, for anyone who's not familiar, in Murshidabad, which is a district north of the Nadia district where Navadip is located. There was a very prominent scholar and publisher in the late 1800s and early 1900s named Ramnarayan Vidyaratna, who was sponsored by a king of Kashim Bajar, an area in Kuch Bihar in the north of Bengal, to publish using, at that time, the new modern printing press. And so he was given a royal pension or a royal patronage for his work and his printing. And he was very prolific, and he had a team, and they published almost all the prominent works that are significant to the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, or that are prominent within the Gaudiya Vaishnava corpus. He did the entire Bhagavatam and the Charitamrita with very commentaries on the Bhagavatam, and many, many other works of Rup, Sanatan, Jiva Gosvami, etc. So one of them was the Padyavali. and in his publication he included a commentary. And this commentary was written by someone named Viracandra Gosvami. So this is not Viracandra, who's also known as Virabhadra, the son of Nityananda Prabhu, but it is a Viracandra Gosvami who is a great-great-great-grandson of that Viracandra. So I looked into a little bit of the background on this commentator. His commentary is called the Rasika-rangada-tika, or the commentary which brings delight to rasikas. And he also wrote a commentary on the Gopal Champu of Jiva Gosvami, and the same person who edited the Bengali translation that I was just referring to of Ramnarayan Vidyaratna, named Rasbihari Sankirtirtha, he also did a translation of the Gopal Champu into Bengali using the commentary of Viracandra Gosvami on the Gopal Champu. So this Rasbihari Sankirtirtha translated both the Padyavali and the Gopal Champu following the Sanskrit commentaries of this Viracandra Gosvami. And in his introduction to the Gopal Champu, he gives some biographical information about Viracandra Gosvami, which is rather interesting, so I'm going to share a few anecdotes from that. He explains that this was written in, I believe, maybe the 1910s or something like that, this introduction. And there he says that he communicated via letters with the son of this Viracandra Gosvami, whose name was Gopal Gosvami, and he received a memoir from the son of Viracandra Gosvami, giving a life sketch of Viracandra Gosvami. So combining what he came to know otherwise with the life sketch he received directly from the son of this Goswami, he wrote a short biography. So from those two sources, what we come to know is that he was either an 8th or a 9th, the two quotes that I find don't quite match, I'm still looking into that, but either an 8th or 9th generation descendant of Nityananda Prabhu from Viracandra Gosvami. So Nityananda Prabhu, then Virabhadra or Viracandra, and then coming down 8 generations to this Viracandra Gosvami. And he was born, what was the date? Sorry, I don't remember off the top of my head. I don't remember off the top of my head. Where did I write that? Anyway, if anyone really cares, they can ask me later. Early 1800s. And what's also interesting is that he is in this family of descendants of Nityananda Prabhu, and he was one of 7 brothers. His father was a scholar named Kishori Mohan Goswami, who settled in a village called Maro, which is in the present day located between Bardhaman and Durgapur, so which is roughly 3 hours west and a little bit north of Navadvip. And this Kishori Mohan Goswami made a temple of Radha Madan Mohan Radha Madhava in that town, which is still a prominent Krishna temple in that town today. And he also ran a Sanskrit school. And he had 7 sons, 4 with one wife and 3 with the other, as was the case of many of these descendants of Nityananda Prabhu, Advaita Prabhu, Srinivasacharya Prabhu in those eras. Having multiple wives was not unheard of. And one of his elder brothers from his father's other wife was named Raghunandan Goswami. And Raghunandan Goswami was an extremely prolific Sanskrit scholar, and in the introduction to one of the books that was published by Sri Haridas Shastri Maharaj, Haridas Shastri Maharaj writes that this Raghunandan Goswami was perhaps the most prolific contributor to Gaudiya Vaishnava literature of the 19th century, or of at least the early 19th century. And he wrote over 30 different books in Sanskrit, with a number of other Bengali books and poems, etc. in Bengali. And he also taught extensively at this school that the 7 Goswami brothers had, who were apparently all versed in Sanskrit and distinguished scholars, but the most prominent of them was this Raghunandan Goswami. So coming back to the author of our commentary, Viracandra Gosvami, he was the youngest son of this family, and his father passed away while he was still in the womb of his mother. 4 months before he was born, Kishori Mohan Goswami passed away. So he was raised by his mother, his stepmother, and his elder brothers. And he started his Sanskrit education at 5 years old. And in his teens, he was personally taught by his elder brother, Raghunandan Goswami, all of the principal works of the Gaudiya Sampradaya, the Bhagavatam with its commentaries, the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Hari Bhakti Vilas, the Ujjal Nilamani, the Govinda Bhashya, and other works. This is all listed out in this biography. And after that, he went on to teach for Sanskrit and Gaudiya Vaishnava literature for many years. And this Viracandra Goswami, although not as famous and quite as prolific as his elder brother Raghunandan Goswami, because he only wrote 20 books in Sanskrit, along with various other Bengali works. So not quite as many as his brother who wrote 30, but 20. But we can say that to write a Sanskrit commentary on a text like the Gopal Champu, which is the magnum opus of Jiva Goswami, wherein he demonstrates the application of every single sutra of his Harinamrita Vyakaran. In other words, he leverages the entire breadth of the Sanskrit language throughout the text. So to write a commentary on that, you have to be an extremely well-educated and broadly educated person. So the fact that his commentary is the principal surviving, if any others were written, I don't know, but at least in the Bengali society, the Gopal Champu that you can find today that still lives in print is the edition with his commentary and the Bengali translation, that was completed according to his translation. So he's best known for these 2 commentaries, the commentary on the Padyavali and the commentary on the Gopal Champu. So I say all of that just to give some background, because as we go through these verses, I'll often be referring to his Sanskrit commentary. But not always. And the reason for that is that some of it is a bit technical and is very useful for understanding the grammatical structure and the expression of the verse in Sanskrit. It clarifies what the meaning of it is when you know Sanskrit, but not all of it is all that relevant to translation as such. In other words, some of it would just translate as being simply synonyms which clarify the meaning of things in Sanskrit, but in English it's a little bit silly to just translate one word in Sanskrit that's just making it clear to you which intended sense is of the other Sanskrit word. So I'm not giving a full translation of the commentary, but the highlights and particularly the aspects of the commentary that pertain to the implied meaning of the poetry, which is, in the words of Kavi Karnapur, in the words of Baladev Vibhushan, the life of the poetry, or the real substance of the poetry is in the implied meaning and the way that implied meaning touches the heart and evokes further absorbed contemplation. So in instances of that, as well as cases where he demonstrates what's called the prasanga, or how the line of thought flows between the verses. In some cases, he makes some nice connections. So in that way, I'll be drawing upon the commentary. But also, I say this with having, glorified him and referred to him and everything. I don't take on board everything, and not all of his comments I consider, necessarily ideal. And also Shushil Kumar Dey, in his critical edition, he also expressed in some cases some reservations about some of the points made in the commentary. In other words, not that they're wrong or bad, but that, they may not be, the one and only way that is ideal to read the verses. So I say that just to be transparent in my presentation, that I'm also presenting this with the, critical eye of my own conscience, and with all due reverence to this commentator. And lastly, I'll just say that there's a beautiful story in this memoir about how he passes away. And it explains that as he aged, he finished the Gopal Champu commentary about 6 or 7 years before he passed on, and his son said that he was very, very concerned that he would complete that work within his lifetime. And after he did, he seemed much more peaceful and relaxed, but also his health started to go down. And in his final years, he decided he only wanted to go to Vrindavan. And so he told all his family members, I'm retiring from everything, I'm leaving, I'm going to Vrindavan. And they appealed to him to stay and to wait and so on, but he eventually insisted when he felt that he wasn't going to live much longer, and so he, made arrangements to depart. So then they said, okay, well, if you're going, we're going with you. So his wife and one of his sons, they accompanied him, and they traveled to Vrindavan, and the son writes in the memoir that they traveled to Vrindavan and he went straight to the Govinda temple. They arrived in the afternoon, and he came to the gate of the temple of Govindaji, and he just bowed down and started rolling back and forth in the dust and gushing tears and trembling and so on. And his son came over to, dust him off and make sure he was okay, and was shocked by this such intense expression of sudden emotion. And then he said, what's happening? What are you feeling now? And he said, you don't understand? This is it, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, I'm gone. I came here to just lay myself at the feet of Govindadev. And then his son made arrangement in one kunja near the Keshigat, and he spent another week or two there all day just hearing his son recite different texts that he found appropriate and chanting the name. And then in his last day of life, he wrote one final Sanskrit ashtakam of meditation on Radha Krishna in the Yog Pit, and passed it on to his son and said, I'll live on just with this. And then he said, this is it, lay me down in the dust, cover me with Radhakund Tilak, write the name all over my body. And then he laid there in the dust and said, okay, sing the name. And then his son, from the memoir you could understand, he must have had some skill as a kirtaniya. And then his son just sang the names, and then other people started to gather around and sing along. And then he waved his hand, stop, 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 stop. I just want to hear this sweet tune coming from him. And then as his son sang like that within a couple of hours, then he was gone. So I thought that was a beautiful account of how a devout Gaudiya Vaishnava might wish to conclude their sojourn in a given body. So anyway, with that remembrance of this beautiful life and holy life of this Goswami, we'll proceed to discuss so much of his commentary on this text. So additionally, I don't want to go on too long with all these details, but just because I don't want to have to mention them again later, that is the Sanskrit commentary, the Rasika-rangada-tika commentary, and I'm drawing that from this edition of the Padyavali with that commentary of Ramyā and Vidiratna, as well as a later edition of the Padyavali with a different Bengali translation by Anandagopal Shastri, who, sadly passed on just a couple of years ago in Radhakund, and I had the pleasure of meeting with him on some occasions at his school in Radhakund, and sometimes seeing him when he would come and lecture at the Jiva Institute. And he was a good friend of our Guru Maharaj, and they had many talks and good times together, and he wrote one of the introductions to one of Baba's books. And from time to time, Baba will share some anecdotes from things they'd discussed at various times. So he also did a Bengali translation of the Padyavali, and that was published with this Rasika-rangada commentary more recently. So I've also, checked through that at times. And there are sometimes different readings of the commentary between these two editions. So sometimes one is more correct than the other, so it's useful to have them both. So those are my sources. And with that, I'll come to the first verse, because in the first verse itself, Rupa Goswami explains what the book is. So we'll just follow his own introduction. So with that, I'll proceed to the first verse. So he starts saying, Padyavali viracitā rasikair Mukunda, sambandha-bandhura-padā, pramadormi-sindhuḥ, ramyā samasta-tamasāṁ damanī krameṇa, saṁgṛhyate kṛti-kadambaka-kautukāya. Lovely verses, or Padyavali. The word padya means a verse, so and Padyavali, avali is a plural suffix, so Padyavali just means verses. So lovely verses composed by rasikas, filled with charming words about Mukunda, which are an ocean of waves of bliss and dispelling of all darkness, are compiled in sequence here in this book for the delight of the competent contingent. So we'll unpack the statements in this verse one by one. I'll go through the commentary. Just the introduction to this first verse, Viracandra Gosvami, he writes, let me just pull up the Sanskrit here. He writes as follows. I won't read all the time the Sanskrit of the commentary just to save time. It's there in the footnotes. But in this case, I'll read it because commentators usually start with some rich extra language as they start off. So this is quite nice. He says, Sri Yukta Vrindaraka Vrinda Mahendra Radha Madhava Parara Vinda Nimagna Manasa Bhakta Sandohananandaka Parama Rasika Vara Kavikula Mukuta Mani Soyam Grantakara Nikila Bhakti Rasikanam Padya Vrindottapanena Shri Krishna Gunalila Varnane Saracharam Darshaya Adunik Tad Bhaktan Harshayangscha Sankepato Bhakti Rasamayam Grantam Arabate Padyāvalī. So he who is the crest jewel of poets, or kavis, the best of exalted rasikas, and a creator of bliss for the multitudes of bhaktas, whose minds are absorbed in the lotus feet of Radha and Madhava. And who are they? The great monarchs among all divinities endowed with beauty. So this is who is Rupa Goswami? He's the best of poets, the best of rasikas, and as such, as a rasika kavi, he gives great bliss to all the bhaktas whose minds are absorbed in meditation on the feet of Radha and Govinda, or Radha and Madhava. And Radha and Madhava are the monarchs, or the best among all divinities. In other words, the aspect of the divine which has the most profound depth of beauty. So, this author, Rupa Gosvami Pad, demonstrating the proper conduct in regard to description of the qualities and leelas of Sri Krishna, and delighting his bhaktas of the modern day by collecting verses from all the bhakti rasikas, that is, numerous poets adept in bhakti rasa, begins concisely this text full of bhakti rasa, Padyavali. He composes this opening verse. So, this is to say that by preparing this composition, he delights the bhaktas at that time, of the modern era, means not from the era of Krishna Lila or from antiquity, but from the time of his writing and up till today as well. He delights bhaktas by presenting or collecting together these poems, and in doing so, he demonstrates how to present description of the qualities and the leelas and so forth of Sri Krishna. So, typically, Sanskrit works are all evaluated according to a fourfold structure of encapsulating their content or their teaching. So this is called the Anubandha-chatushtaya, and authors don't always spell it out like, as a bulleted list, but they write in such a way that educated readers can infer these elements from what they say. So in this case, we can infer the Anubandha-chatushtaya from this introductory verse. So the four elements of the Anu-chatushtaya just means four. So these four connections, or these four interrelated elements of a literary work. The first thing is the Vishaya, the subject of the text. So who's the subject of the text? Mukunda, as the verse said. These are lovely verses filled with charming words about Mukunda. So the name Mukunda obviously is a name of Krishna, and Baladeva Vibhushan, in his commentary on the Mukundashtakam of Rupa Gosvami, in the Stavamala, Rupa Gosvami writes a poem specifically about Krishna using the name Mukunda. So there, Baladeva Vibhushan gives two principal meanings of the name Mukunda. One is that mu and kunda, the break comes here. So the prefix mu is taken to mean muk, or face. And then kunda is a common name, still today in Bengali, the same name as there. Kunda means a type of jasmine flower. So mu meaning muka kunda, whose face, or the smile on whose face is like a kunda flower, like a jasmine flower. This is Mukunda. Or the other primary meaning is that mukun is taken as a unit, and then da is separated. So mukun or mukun is said to mean mukti, and da is to mean to give or to cause. So the giver of mukti. And that may mean, moksha in the classical sense as deliverance from samsara, or the commentator, Baladeva Vibhushan, he says it can also refer to freedom or liberation from the state of being separated from Krishna when he again gives his darshan, or when he again becomes visible. So whether we take him as the giver of liberation from something undesirable, be it samsara conventionally speaking, or be it separation from him, in either case he can be called Mukunda. So Mukunda is the subject of our text, and then his greatness, devotion to him, his leela, his associates, all these other things are subtopics within this overall principal subject, Mukunda. So then, as in the case of any literary work, the sambandha, or the relation between the work and the subject, is called the vachya-vachaka sambandha, or the referent-referrer relationship. This is also discussed by Jiva Gosvami in Tattva Sandarbha, I think it's Anucheda 9, in the beginning, where he lays out the core elements of the 6 Sandarbhas. He uses the same language. So the text is the referrer, it's referring to the subject, and the subject is the referent, or the vachya, the thing that is to be described by the text. So in that way, the text and the subject have this relationship. So then, who is the audience, or who is this text for? And for that, he simply says that it is for those who are kriti. So the word kriti here I'm translating as competent, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that in a minute, what that means. But just to finish this Anubandha-chatushtaya, the fourth element is the prayojana, or the aim or the purpose of the text. So he says that this text is, as he says in the last line, for the delight of the competent contingent. So in other words, the purpose of the text is to make the Vaishnavas joyful, to bring joy to their hearts by giving them the chance to read and relish all these beautiful poems about Mukunda. So the purpose, the aim, is delighting the, quote, competent, or the kriti. So what does he mean by the word kriti here? The commentator doesn't elaborate on this. So I think elaboration is due, and in this and in many cases as we go through, I in some cases follow the line of the thought of the commentator and leave it at that. In some cases I follow his line of thought and elaborate on what the direction he's going with it. And in some cases I offer another perspective. So in this particular case, he doesn't elaborate or gloss the word, so I'm just providing context as I see fit. So the word kriti is found in the second verse, the Mangalacharanam of the Bhagavatam, which is an extremely central and well-known verse within our Gaudiya Vaishnava world. So in the last line there it says, Sadhyo hridya varudhyateta kritibhis, shushusubhis, takshanat. Translated as, here in Srimad Bhagavatam, Ishvara is bound within the heart by the kritis, or kritibhi is the instrumental plural of the word kriti. So by those who are called kriti, who are also shushubhis, or shushubhi means who desire to listen to this Bhagavatam. And immediately from the time that they start to listen, then the binding or the fixing of Hari within the heart begins. So this hearing process is no light process. This is a very powerful process. It's the process by which Bhagavan himself gets bound up within the heart. So how do the commentators explain the word kriti in this verse in the Bhagavatam? Because it's likely that Rupa Goswami is choosing this word because it's also the same word that is used to describe the listeners of the Bhagavatam. So Sridhar Samipad, he glosses it by simply saying that a kriti is one who is punya, one who is meritorious, or one who has merit. And he contextualizes it like this. Kritibhi and shushubhi. Shushubhi means desiring to listen. So the people who desire to listen, they start to bind Ishvara within their heart by listening. So you might wonder, well, what makes them want to listen? Where did they get this desire to listen? So Sridhar Swami interprets it that the word kritibhi is stated in the verse to explain the cause of the desire they have to listen to the text about Bhagavan. So why do they desire to listen to about Bhagavan? Because they have merits, or because, in other words, because without those merits, they wouldn't have that desire. So the merits are the cause of the desire. That's all he says. Just a short, simple point. So what does that word merit or punya in this context mean? So Jiva Gosvami, in classical form, comes along, taking up Sridhar Swami's line of thought, and then gets a little more fine with things. So he comes in his commentary and he says, okay, kriti, really it means sukriti, not just merits in general, but some special type of merits. So then, but he doesn't, in that exactly there, in the Krama-sandarbha on the first verse, he doesn't elaborate further, but if we look at where the same verse is quoted in the Bhakti-sandarbha elsewhere, he gives some further discussion about this later. And essentially what he says is that this special merit is a samskara for bhakti, either from a past life or created by the association or the gracious glance of a Mahatma in this life. So the merit or the competence that's being referred to here then is the samskara for bhakti that's lodged within the psyche of the person. So when Rupa Goswami says that this book is for delighting these people who have this competence or who have this samskara, what he means is that this is not a book for karmis, this is not a book for gyanis, this is not a book for non-bhaktas, this is a book for bhaktas. This is a book for people who have the samskar to relish this poetry, because you won't relish it if you don't have this samskara. And more broadly, if we look in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, when he's talking about the adhikar for bhakti in a broader sense, then he explains that those who are eligible, or those who have the adhikar, have atibhagya. he uses this word, great fortune. So again, it's a little broad. What does this great fortune mean? So Jiva Gosvami in his commentary, he says, Mahat Sangari Samskar Vishesha, that the special samskar that's created by having had the association of a mahat, of a great bhakta, that's the fortune. Winning the lottery, that's a good fortune. There's so many conventional notions of fortune in the world, but in this line of thought, fortune means somehow this samskar got lodged in your psyche. Somehow you got this favorable interaction with this Mahatma, such that this samskar for bhakti got planted in you. That is the great fortune. And there's a point related to this, which is a point that Baba often quotes, and which is quite insightful, I find, from the very end of the introduction to the Bhakti Rasamrita-sindhuḥ, where he's concluding the introduction, and he's referring also back to a verse he makes in the invocation of auspiciousness, where he says that this Bhakti Rasamrita-sindhuḥ is not for karmis and gyanis. It's for people with samskaras for bhakti. And so he concludes by trying to dismiss the tendency for people to come along and scrutinize this just with reductive reasoning. So he concludes the introduction with this statement that I've got here. Even just a little taste or ruchi shall be an illuminator of the nature of bhakti. Pure reasoning, however, is certainly not, because of its inconclusiveness. So this is, he's saying, you might read this book, but will you actually understand what the book means? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the attunement of your mind, whether you'll get it or not. So what is the thing that's going to illuminate and enable you to grasp the subject that's being described in this book? That illuminating element that's essential to having the experience of the referent, of the object that the text is trying to describe, he's saying that illuminator is called ruchi. It's called some taste for this thing. So what is that taste? So then Jiva Gosvami, he comes in more fine, and he says this taste is this sense that when I hear about Bhagavan, when I hear these texts that describe bhakti, that describe Bhagavan, like the Bhagavatam, I get this, he calls it uttamatva gyan. I get this sense that this is the best, this is a great thing. So this is really simple. This, in the sense of taste, when, someone offered, would you like some dessert? And then you try the dessert, and then you find, this is excellent. You just have this sense, this is a great thing that I'm tasting. It's very sweet. It's just, the sense comes to you because you have the ability to appreciate it. So that sense, the way you eat dessert and it tastes great and you find, wow, I'm eating something excellent today. Similarly, you hear the Bhagavatam and you feel, this is excellent. This is beautiful. I relish this. I find this appealing and pleasing and delighting to my heart. That sensibility or that capacity to taste what the Bhagavatam or what any of these texts that describe Bhakti and Bhagavan are, that taste is what is essential to then having an actual experience or grasping what the text is actually describing. Meaning, if someone doesn't have that taste, they'll read the book, but they won't get what the book says. They won't have the experience that the book could enable them to have. Rather, they'll scrutinize the grammar or the logic or the plausibility or the historicity and all these other features of the thing. So Jiva Goswami goes on to say, and this is also very interesting, that this ruchi, or this taste, this sense that this is great, that is what illuminates the nature of bhakti, and that is the fundamental premise of faith, or shraddha. Usually we're always hearing ado shraddha. First of all is the shraddha. But then we hear in the commentary, well, not quite. to get the shraddha, you have to hear the shastra from the mouth of the sadhu. So, sadhu sange shastra shravan dvara, by hearing the shastra in the association of the sadhu, the faith will emerge. But now we're going another sub-level, and it's saying, but that will happen if you have this samskar, if you have the ability to taste and appreciate this thing, to feel its greatness, to taste it, then you'll get conviction, you'll get confidence, you'll have determination and resolve in the value of what it is. You'll have faith in it. So this is quite interesting because it clearly distinguishes the shraddha of the teachings and the path of Rupa Goswami from fanaticism, from blind belief, from mere pledging to a creed or adopting a dogma. But it's fundamentally at the very core an aesthetic experience. It's an experience that's found to be proof positive in the moment, fulfilling. And that is the very kernel of the conviction that becomes the life of every form of sadhana that one ever does in one's life. So to acquire that taste is an incredible fortune, is an incredible privilege, and is incredibly essential to going along this path in the spirit with which it was intended. So that taste, or that samskar, that enables people to appreciate all of these things, to have faith in it as one is meant to have faith in it, that comes again from the sadhu, from that association gradually. So you could say it's a feedback loop or a cause and effect mutual dependence, or in another sense it's a catch-22. If you don't have the association, you can't have the taste. If you don't have the taste, you're not interested in the association. Without the association, you don't get the taste, you're stuck out of the loop. But if you're in the association, that nourishes the taste. With the taste, you find more refined appreciation of the association, and then it spirals one in, so to speak. So this is one reason that the currents of samsara are hard to predict, or how anyone might get carried this way, that way, into this spiral, that spiral. It's quite beyond prediction. Anyhow, I won't elaborate too widely here. There's other points in this commentary, but I don't want to take too long on all this. So, just to bring it back to this introductory verse, this competent contingent, or this, what does this refer to then? It refers to the people who have this taste, who have this samskara for bhakti. This book is for them, and when they hear this book, they will be delighted. There's no doubt. Rupa Goswami knows what he's doing, he knows his audience, and he knows they're going to appreciate what's described here. So therefore, he says these verses are filled with charming words, or bandhura-padā. So the word bandhura means charming or attractive, and he also describes it then as a pramadormi-sindhuḥ, or an ocean of waves of delight. And he uses another adjective, ramyā, or lovely, which the commentator takes to mean most relishable. So when you have the samskar for the taste, then you find it to be relishable, and you find it to produce wave after wave of joy. So that's, what we're going for here. And the commentator, another point he brings up is that, which is kind of interesting, he says, okay, well, why did the author, or the compiler, namely Rupa Goswami, why did he bother compiling all these verses in a book? When people he could have just relished all these in his own mind. He could have just focused on them. Why did he go to the endeavor of making the book? Then he says, because he wants to bring joy not only to himself but for others, then he made the book. But then he raises a second question, and he says, well, if these people are all competent and they're already relishers of bhakti, then why do they need his book? They can write their own poems. They can read their own books. So why should he make a book for them? So in that sense, he might be taking the word kriti or competent in the sense of one who's competent to also compose poetry about Bhagavan. So then he says, well, they'll still, even if they're competent, even if they can write their own poetry and relish their own things, still they'll relish Rupa Goswami's books too. And why? And he gives 3 reasons. He says, because Rupa Goswami is a patra, he's a highly capable compiler, he's priya, he's very dear to Mahaprabhu, and he has very deep prema for Bhagavan, be it Mahaprabhu or Krishna. So because he's very competent, he's very dear, and he has great love, whatever he makes is going to be nice. So they'll be happy to relish that. They'll be glad that Rupa Goswami took this effort for them. So, I mean, these are the way, just giving very, very sort of broken down, concise lines of reasoning. And then he also takes another line of thought regarding the phrase in the opening verse, samasta-tamasāṁ damanī, that these verses dispel darkness. So then he raises the question, why do you have to say that? If they produce waves and waves of bliss, that's not good enough? Why do we need another descriptive modifier of these verses? And he says, because those who are truly astute, they're not interested, they're not hooked just when you offer them happiness. Because in this world, and typically, happiness also comes with its flip side, other side of the coin of suffering in the world of samsara, the world of karma. As much as you enjoy, that much you suffer. You go around in this cyclic exchange. So if you come around and say, I've got this great thing, then you're basically telling me, I've got this thing that's going to give you a lot of immediate pleasure and a bunch of delayed suffering. Do you want it? From this kind of raw, cold analysis, this is how the karmic thing looks. So they might say, oh, waves of bliss? No, that sounds too problematic. So rather, as Jiva Gosvami discusses in the opening Anucheda of the Priti-sandarbha, what is the purushartha of every living embodied being? It's both the attainment of happiness that's coupled with the elimination of suffering. It's happiness that doesn't produce as a consequence, as a byproduct, future suffering, but happiness that actually also dispels future suffering. That must be the thing that's aspired for by anyone who has a good perspective on what's in their own interest. So, the commentator, he says that Rupa Goswami adds this phrase, dispelling of darkness, just to be sure that these astute, shastric, learned, readers of his book don't get suspicious and think that this is just going to produce some karmic bliss. No. This is the type of bliss that's coupled with the complete dissolution of ignorance, which is the root cause of all suffering. So, what is that phrase in the Priti-sandarbha? Jivasya? I forget how it goes. Anyway, where Jiva Goswami says that the fundamental cause of all suffering for every jiva is the absence of awareness of Bhagavan. This obliviousness of Bhagavan is the root deficiency from which all forms of suffering arise. So this text dispels that darkness or alleviates that ignorance by beautifully portraying and making known so many things about Bhagavan. Therefore it dispels suffering and causes bliss, and therefore those who are astute to the pursuit of what is truly fulfilling, they will surely be glad to hear these poems. And then one last thing I want to elaborate on in this verse is the word rasikas. He says that the verses are compiled by he's compiled them, these verses that are composed by rasikas. So the commentator simply says that here rasika means bhakti rasikas. So what actually is a rasika? That's also, I think, relevant to this discussion. So, again, my inclination is to read the word rasika here as an allusion to the third verse of the Bhagavatam, the Mangalacharan of the Bhagavatam, which famously says, Muhuraho rasika, bhubi bhavuka. That, oh rasikas, drink this rasa, drink this Bhagavatam. This famous statement. So, in that phrase, what does the word rasika mean? So Sridhar Swami, he says that it means a rasagya. A rasika is a rasagya. A rasika means one who knows rasa. And Jiva Gosvami elaborates, saying it means one who knows rasa, specifically Bhagavad Priti rasa, the rasa of Priti or Prema for Bhagavan, that type of rasa. And moreover, he comes back and he says, and how do they know that? What is it that makes them knowledgeable of that rasa? He says, because they have samskaras from the past and the present life that dispose them to appreciate rasa. So it goes back to the very same concept of fortune, the very same concept of competence, that fundamentally this samskara, which makes one competent to appreciate these things, when that becomes fortified or profoundly, when the psyche becomes profoundly in tune with that, if you will, or it becomes predominant therein, then the person can relish these things to the depth or extent that there is the rasa as Rupa Gosvami defines it. So that's one way of understanding it, and Chakravarti Pad, he specifically comments that the rasikas mentioned in that verse in the Bhagavatam are rasikas with a sthayi bhav, which has been elevated to the state of rasa. In other words, he takes it to refer to siddha bhaktas. And Rupa Goswami, in the Sindhu, I've given a quotation here, he describes how this rati, when someone has the relevant samskaras, arises with all the other elements of the rasa to give rise to this experience. So I can't elaborate on that now. I assume people are familiar with these elements based on the classes we've heard on Priti Sandarbha, and for those who've studied the Sthayi Bhav Prakaran in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So anyway, I've given a few more things in the commentary here. I won't elaborate on it all. But the other point I want to come to is that other than this viewpoint of a rasika being a siddha bhakta who's directly relishing rasa as Rupa Goswami defines it, Sanatana Gosvami, in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, he gives a little broader definition of a rasika. And there's a beautiful set of verses where he has Parikshit Maharaj speak to Narad Rishi in praise of Bhakti Rasikas and how they're as dear to him as Bhagavan is, their association is as desirable as Bhagavan's association is. And in essence, he describes a Bhakti Rasika as one who has a one-pointed desire for prema. He even uses the word lobha, which is, we find a technical word in Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So those who are intensely and one-pointedly desirous of prema, who are have completely taken shelter in Bhagavan, have given up the path of karma, gyan, worldly consideration, other pursuits, etc., that person will be a rasika. So that person could be a siddha. That person, as Sanatana Goswami describes it, could also be a sadhaka. So in other words, the word rasika from Sanatana Goswami's perspective in this context isn't just necessarily a siddha bhakta, but it could be a sadhaka who's resolutely in pursuit of that attainment. And in fact, in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, where he's describing the adhikari for his book, the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, he says that a rasika is the only person who's qualified to read my book. So if we make the definition of rasika so high that none of us can ever be rasikas, we can never read the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. But obviously that wasn't the intention. Rather, he's saying this to inspire the readers to have this type of one-pointedness of desire, and to say that it's only when one acquires that one-pointedness of desire that by hearing this book, the full experience of actually relishing the rasa of prem for Bhagavan will come to actually take place. But at the same time, that someone, will also read the text or will also go through the process of hearing it, so that lobha, or so that longing in the heart can gradually mature, so that it can be nourished by hearing. That, of course, is the whole process, as we hear in the Bhakti Rasamrita-sindhuḥ, and also as it's summarized in the Charitamrita, in essence, where it's saying, Taha shuni lubdha hoy kono bhagyavan. That some, again, same language, some bhagyavan, some fortunate person, means some person with the samskar created by the sadhusanga, by hearing this, acquires the intense desire. So the hearing is essential, and therefore the hearing of the text is essential, and it's through the hearing of the text that the adhikar deepens. So ultimately what I'm trying to say here is that the persons who presented these verses, we can conceive of them as siddha bhaktas, or maybe not. Maybe they don't all have to be siddha bhaktas. They could have also been sincere aspirants who, out of their longing and desire for prema for Krishna, went about writing this poetry. And if we look at it more critically, then the verses in the Padyavali, if you research them, where they're drawn, the authors, the poets that they're quoted from, not all of those poets were even Vaishnavas. Some of them were Shaivas. Some of them were, followers of other margas. And the text that Rupa Goswami drew on, although he's saying the verses here are composed by rasikas, they're actually not all literally composed by Vaishnavas. And that's okay. We can say, obviously, Rupa Goswami is making a generalization. And we know that in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, Rupa Goswami understood exactly what Mahaprabhu meant when Mahaprabhu was singing a verse which was composed by a non-Vaishnava. And not only was composed by a non-Vaishnava, but was about a non-Vaishnava topic. It was a verse about a lady with a paramour who's, off by the river. About in the mud of the mundane, right? But he's taking that as, a nudipana for remembrance of Radha Krishna Leela. So, in a deeper sense, whether the poet was a rasika or not, and even if the subject matter of the poem is about Krishna or not, for those who have the bhava, everything or anything can be a sufficient udipana. And those very verses that I'm referring to are also discussed later or cited in the Padyavali. And also interestingly, as Sushil Kumar De illustrates, some of the verses are also edited. In other words, Rupa Goswami is crediting the sources of all these poets that he's quoting, but in some cases he's changing their verses. And some of the verses originally had the name Ram in them, and then in Rupa Goswami's poem they say Krishna. Some of them just say Deva, and he changes it to Krishna. And he makes other, modifications to some of the quotations to suit his audience, or to suit those who are aspiring for bhakti to Krishna specifically. So that's why I mentioned this point of Sanatana Gosvami, to say that this is because this is the ideal audience. You can also see how the author is writing for that audience in the editing that he's doing of the text. And that brings me to another topic, which is that Rupa Goswami, where did he get all of these verses? We don't know entirely, but there were existing compilations of verses in the era that he lived. One of the most well-known was called the Kṛti-Kadambaka-kautukāya by one Sridhar Das, which was composed in the 1200s in the court of Lakshman Sen, who was one of the most prominent Vaishnava kings historically in Bengal. And it's some, I think, 2,000 something verses on a variety of topics. And I haven't made a count yet, but quite a number of the verses in the Padyavali can all be found also in that Kṛti-Kadambaka-kautukāya. So as Sanatana Goswami drew upon other Padatis when he built the Hari Bhakti Vilas, so also in compiling this Padyavali, Rupa Goswami is not necessarily just mining through individual poems or individual works by these different writers, but he's also mining from pre-existent compilations of other compilers. So how many things he drew directly out of a book, or how many things he drew from a pre-existent compilation, it's hard to say entirely, but it's likely he used some compilations as sources. So anyway, that's relevant to what I wanted to mention. And lastly, one last thing I want to say on that topic is that at the very end of the Padyavali, he also mentions that he excludes two of the most greatest Rasika poets that we ever heard of. Interestingly, he says, and not included in this compilation are the verses of Jiva Gosvami or Bilvamangal Thakur, who, as we hear in the Charitamrita, Mahaprabhu relished Bilvamangal's Karnamrita, Jayadev's Gita Govinda, Chandidas's Padas, Vidyapati's Padas, etc. So Rupa Goswami has excluded Jayadev and Bilvamangal. So you might say, well, why? If they're so great, then what would be the need? So the commentator, he says, because those poems are already so common and so frequently relished, Rupa Goswami considered it unnecessary to fill his book with those verses that everyone is already relishing. So he's adding lesser known content to what is already available and commonly included. So it's not that he excluded them because he didn't consider them valuable. Rather, he considered them so valuable and already so prominent that it wasn't necessary. So, just in case anyone was thinking, where is anything from the Karnamrita? Then now you know why. And one last point I'll make, which is also perhaps noteworthy, is that here the book begins, and there's no mention of Mahaprabhu. As in the Sindhu, as in other works of Rupa Goswami, the texts begin with a pranam to Mahaprabhu. This verse has no mention of Mahaprabhu in the introduction, this book, but it does include citations of the verses that we know as the Shikshastakam. So, from that grounds, some scholars infer that this must have been most likely a very early work of Rupa Goswami, prior to his composing of these later works, which were perhaps after he had received further or more significant association with Mahaprabhu. And another reason that this was an earlier work is that there are quotations of his own writings in this book. I think it's some 30 verses of his own he includes. However, none of the verses he includes are verses that can be found in the book Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Ujjal Nilamani, or his Natakas. So when he's writing the Ujjal Nilamani principally, and also the Sindhu, he quotes a lot of his own poems, or gives a lot of his own writing as examples of what he's trying to illustrate. But he never does that here. So, some reason that this must have been an earlier work, and then later, when he went about writing and illustrating many of those things, then he had those things in those later works. So, on those two grounds, the text is likely earlier on in the Rupa Goswami's career. So, two things I'll conclude with. One is that as I'm presenting this discussion and as we go through these verses, then what is my attitude? Or not that this is about me, but that as I present these things, I also want to be transparent in my intention and manner in which I'm going about this service offering. And something I was reflecting on this week, which I thought to share and which I feel resonates with me, if you will, is a statement of Vishnu Das Goswami from the conclusion of his commentary on the Ujjal Nilamani. So Vishnu Das Goswami was a disciple of Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami, and he wrote a commentary on the Ujjal Nilamani entitled Svatma Pramodini, which means this commentary which is delighting to myself. I'm writing this commentary for my own delight. And at the very end, when he's concluding the commentary, he writes a verse where he explains what he means by that. So I'm just going to read that verse. He says, Nahi paramata khandanaya vadyair, nacha nija mata saṁgṛhyate loke, apitu nija manovalambanartam, paramahi kilana prayatna esha. So I've translated that as follows. Neither for the sake of refuting the views of others with disputation, nor for the sake of consolidation of our own view in this world. This effort here of ours, meaning this commentary on the Ujjal Nilamani, is only for the sake of support of our own mind. So what he means by that is that I'm writing this commentary so that I can understand and have, a platform or a basis to absorb my mind in the worship of Krishna. That's why I study these texts. That's why I go into the details of these texts. That's why I go about the process of writing these texts. Because even writing, the process of consolidation, of reflection, of articulation, is also extremely useful in refining and drawing out, more advanced contemplation of the subject matter. So what he wants to say is that I'm not here to argue with other people, I'm not here to debate things, I'm not here to promote my opinion in the world or any of this. I'm here to try to support my effort on a personal level of absorbing my mind in the worship of Krishna. So, as Krishna himself says, in what Jiva Gosvami calls his ultimate of all teachings in the Bhagavad Gita, Manmana bhava mad bhakto. Fix your mind on me, be my devotee. And, whether you do anything else, even if you do the namaskar, the worship, or this or that or anything, it should always be first, fundamentally, manmana, that with the mind given to me. This is the most difficult and most important thing to give. If you don't give this, what have you really given? So this is, in the core essence, to give our hearts, to give our minds to Krishna. And to comment on these texts, to relish these texts, to contemplate these texts in a way that supports that offering of our hearts. That is the purpose. That is what he writes as this delighting to myself, or supporting my own heart in its aspiration to dedicate itself to the loving service of Krishna. So as we go through, what comes or what discussion comes, it's in that spirit. It's not with any other aim or any other, social ambition, if you will. So I wanted to just say that from my heart. And lastly, I'd like to share in conclusion a verse that Viracandra Gosvami, the commentator, writes in praise of the Padyavali, which he includes in his opening to his commentary, where he speaks in praise of the Padyavali in a beautiful way. So I'm going to conclude with that. He says, Ya ramyā nikilaga sanga shamani shrotratitim sangata, Ya sadhya rasikair sukabdi janani dikarya mukti spriham, Ya dhyata hridaye vrajendra tanuja premamrita syandini, Saji yad hari bhakta vrinda mohita dhanyeha padyāvalī. This which is lovely, quelling of all sins, and appropriate for the guest of the ears, which is relishable by rasikas, the mother of an ocean of bliss, and contemning of the desire for mukti, and which is meditated upon in the heart, and oozing with the nectar of prema for the prince of Braja. May this blessed Padyavali, adored by bhaktas of Hari, triumph here in this world. So by saying it's appropriate for the guest of the ears, then this is, set within the understanding of the idea that to serve the guest is a very serious and deep duty, as it is said in the Upanishads, Atiti Devo Bhava. May the guest be Deva himself. In other words, a dharmic attitude is to treat the guest as God and to render him all the most due respect. So to say that this is appropriate for the guest of the ears means what's the best thing you could put into your ears to show them the greatest respect as if they were a very VIP guest. Then you can sing them the Padyavali. That will be a sure way to honor and satisfy your guest. This is the sense. So they're fit to be meditated upon, and they're oozing with the nectar of prema. So if we're so blessed, in the coming days and discussions, we'll hear and discuss these verses to foster meditation upon them, such that a little bit of that may ooze out and become embedded in our hearts. So I'll conclude with that. If anyone has any comment, question, or anything else, they're welcome to share. Yes?
Pranam, Dandavat Pranam Baba. Thank you very much for this beautiful introductory lecture on the Padyavali. Thank you so much also for taking the time to organize this for us. Much gratitude. I have a few very beginner's questions, because I feel like everyone who is present here doing the PhD on Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, and I'm in the kindergarten. So I apologize for the simplicity of my question in advance. So it's about etymology of a few words. First of all, could you please clarify the word Padyavali, the etymology of the word Padyavali? Is this the simple verses in plural, or is it lovely verses? Which one it is?
It's just verses in plural. The word lovely is a separate word, ramyā, in the verse.
Okay. And also, in the very beginning, you have been speaking about Gopal Champu. And Gopal, I understand, is the name of the Lord. And I was wondering about the etymology of the word Champu. What does it mean? Because I don't know.
Etymology of the word I couldn't say precisely, but the meaning of the word is that it's a particular genre of composition which uses not only meters in fixed verse, but uses a more open format of writing where there's less stricture in terms of the metrical formation, and thus it's more challenging for the writers because they have more freedom. So to write something that is of great impressiveness to an erudite audience, the Champu genre is considered one of the most challenging areas of writing, and the Ananda Vrindavan Champu, the Gopal Champu, these are where the poets bring out their heavy arsenal of skill and demonstrate their repertoire of all different types of literary ornaments.
Okay, understood. Also, I have a little bit could you please clarify for me, because the two words rasa, English translation is taste, as far as I understand, and also the word ruchi also is used in English as an English translation is taste. But I was wondering if there is any difference of them. I guess probably the difference, if it exists, in degree of the taste, or if I'm wrong, please correct me and enlighten me, what is the difference between those two, if there is any at all, ruchi and rasa, and why the two words used in the different situations.
So this is an instance where translation becomes problematic, in that Rupa Gosvami, he has a theological system, and he has precise concepts that he's labeled using certain words, or he's turned certain words, which are just words in the language into terms that have technical significance. And in most cases, he's using a pre-existent set of terminology that comes from the rasa theorists that precede him, going back to Bharat Muni. So, just as, in biology or chemistry or different fields of knowledge, certain words that are used in common day speech can have particular technical meaning within particular spheres of discourse, where they mean something different than what you might use them on the day-to-day basis. Similarly, the word ruchi, the way I'm using it tonight in the verses that I quoted, that's one instance of how Rupa Goswami has used it. He himself uses it differently later in the Bhakti Rasamrita-sindhu, when he lists these stages in the manifestation of prema into the heart of a sadhaka, ado shraddha, tatu sadhu sangha, these stages. Then one of those stages is ruchi, nishta, then ruchi, then asakti, then bhava. So in that case, each of those 9 stages is technically defined with a definition by Jiva Goswami. So that ruchi of stage number 6 and this ruchi that we discussed tonight, which is the prerequisite of even shraddha, are obviously not the two same thing. If shraddha is stage 1 and ruchi is stage 6, and then ruchi is preliminary to shraddha, then obviously ruchi number 2 is not the same thing as ruchi number 1. So even within Rupa Goswami's own book, he himself is even using the same word at different times with different meanings. So that's why sometimes translation can complicate matters, because if we, translate it to a word, we can lose the context of it being a technically defined term within a specific context. So similarly, the word rasa, if you say the word rasa in Bengal, down here, or if you add an A on the end, they think you're talking about what's for lunch. They're like, oh, rasa hame, They're going to think you're going to cook a little extra for them today at lunchtime. So, everywhere from, vegetables at lunch to, the most advanced state of spiritual experience, which is the aim of the path that we're on, the word has a huge range of meaning, and then in Ayurveda it means something else, and in chemistry it means something else, and then in conventional rasa shastra it means something else, and then in Rupa Goswami's literature it means something else, and then sometimes when Sanatana Gosvami uses it, it's not the same exactly as the way Rupa Goswami used it, and etc., etc., etc. All the words are just ideally understood specifically in context. And then sometimes we can translate them to English, and sometimes, in my opinion, it's more convenient to just not translate them, to just understand that they have certain technical meanings and just use the technical word. The way that, the same thing happens, like in Bengali, so many English words are not translated. They're just like phone. Phone is just a phone. An app is just an app. A mobile is just a mobile. They don't translate mobile to like sachala, or, they don't just take whatever the word means and then turn it into their language. They just use the word from the other language because it's actually a new thing to their culture. So similarly, bhakti rasa is not like part of, conventional European parlance or something like that. So we could translate the word, but in one sense it's more convenient to just tag it as something that we don't understand, so that to understand it, we have to acquire an understanding of the concept that it's built on. Like this, then we can understand when and where. But to know the concept and what would be the literal translation is also useful to appreciate the intention that the author had.
Understood. And the last question, which is very similar to the previous one, it was about the difference between kṛti and prema. So it's also translated as love in the both cases, or is it also difference in the degree? Like, can I say that kṛti is like liking and prema more like love, or is not? It's not like that. It's very similar, I
For
guess,
the
to
most part,
previous-
they're essentially synonymous. I mean, the way Jiva Gosvami uses it in Priti Sandarbha, there's no significant difference from how Rupa Goswami speaks of prema. Theologically, it's the same.
So can we say that there is no difference in the degree in these two words, like in the degree of love in prema and priti?
Yeah,
They're
same.
like synonyms.
Same, yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, then that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
Another kindergartner here.
Uh-oh.
The word kriti, you mentioned that, well, reading here, it comes from some one who has merit or punya. And you also mentioned that, because I'm just trying to understand here that that merit that would actually come from the blessings of a mahat. So it's almost kind of like, but then to have association of mahat, you would also have to have some samskaras. So it's kind of like a little bit of a loop, which
That's exactly what I was saying, exactly that earlier.
So it's kind of like what comes first, the chicken or the egg? We don't really know which one is first, right?
Yeah. It's, I mean, sometimes, there's that verse in the Bhagavatam, sometimes a piece of driftwood washes up on the shore. Like, how did it come out? It's like, who knows? Sometimes it washes up, in the midst of all the different blending of social circumstances and psychological dispositions. Somehow, all this cycling through samsara churns out these rare circumstances where a great soul meets another soul such that the samskar flourishes, or such that it's nourished. And when and where and how that will happen is essentially impossible to predict, but it's great when it does.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, we can sign off here, and we'll...
Can I have something?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Thank you. A few minutes, because I really like the introduction describing the Viracandra Gosvami's life. It's really amazing. It shows me the wide spectrum of those classical traditional Vaishnavas. There was great society, actually, of Vaishnavas that maintain the parampara, sampradaya, moving forward. I was just wondering about this ruchi you mentioned as a prerequisite or fundamental to Shraddha. And same thing, who is this? Jiva Gosvami mentioned also that first, there's no Shraddha without Sadhu Sangha. He mentioned that primarily to Shraddha, there's initial Sadhu Sangha, which is not mentioned in the verse of Rupa Gosvami. So it starts off with Shraddha, Sadhu Sangha, though. So, but actually, initially, there is Sadhu Sangha, then is Shraddha, and then is another Sadhu Sangha that will solidify the faith. And again, now you mentioned this ruchi is a fundamental to Shraddha. And and also, what comes to my mind is what Haridas Shastri was saying, that once you become bhakta, all these levels, ruchi, anartha-nivritti and so on, all these levels are all insignificant. It's all insignificant. They don't really go on stage by stage. That's basically you're bhakta, and you overcome all of them. You went all through all of them at once. I'm not sure exactly what did he mean, but what it gives me idea is understanding that those are maybe by stage, like anartha-nivritti would be signified as, removing anarthas. But even within anartha-nivritti, there may be some moments of asakti or ruchi, sparks of ruchi appearing also. It's not that you would just jump from one to another and closing the previous one. And some of them, for example, bhajana kriya, it's not a stage, it's occupation of bhakta. It persists all the way to prema. There's always bhajana kriya. It's always existing, really, right? It's not a closed stage, then you jump from one, like from grade to grade. Maybe you can, I would like to entertain a little bit discussion on how those levels, I would say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Anatha-nivritti, ruchi, asakti, bhava, and so on. Are they are they fluid? Are they not fluid? How are they? How do they really function in practical life? Would you be able to just give some hints?
I could say a little bit. Some years back when we studied the Madhurya Kadambani, then there it's also Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad. He gives like a grid, if you will, of how anartha-nivritti happens partially, mostly, almost completely, and then completely without the possibility of reversal. And then he analyzes anarthas into 4 groups. Anarthas produced by worldly meritorious activity, anarthas produced by unmeritorious activity, anarthas produced by aparad, and anarthas produced by bhakti. This is just the other day in Baba's class, he was like, you hear this and you got to think for a minute. Anarthas produced by bhakti, but it doesn't literally mean produced by bhakti, but arising along with bhakti, in the sense that one does bhakti, then one acquires pratishta, this becomes, also an anartha. So anyway, he then looks at these 4 categories of anarthas and then shows at which of these later stages, ruchi, asakti, bhava, prema, to what percentage those things are actually terminated. And to be honest, I can't give you the grid off the top of my head. I can share the information with you, but in gist, the idea is that it's not like, okay, purge yourself of 100% of all anarthas, and then we'll entertain the idea that maybe you have a little nishta. Like it's not meant to be interpreted like that, but rather that it's a grayscale, gradual transformation. And even at 90% white, that means there's still 10% black. So, you might see someone who has many, many symptoms or qualities of being very advanced, but from time to time or on some occasion, a black spot might also be visible, or whatever. So it's not that we want to be kind of excessively rigid in our interpretation of these categories, and Jiva Gosvami also himself comments on these stages that these are common. The order that's given, it's common. Meaning, it's not even that it always happens in this order anyway for everybody. But it's a way to give people a map, or a way to give us some idea about the process, which is essentially the extent to which prema manifests into the psyche of the bhakta and purges out everything that's not prema. I mean, this is basically what it is, and then where and when every last corner and nook and residue and etc. is all gone, different stages, different degrees, different ways it expressed, and that's, for the most part, it's for our personal contemplation and our own tools for personal introspection to understand how we can, mature, and how we can refine our own practice and the day-to-day cultivation of this path, and what to favor, what to disfavor, what to nourish, what to not nourish, as we think and foster various thoughts and feelings.
Thank you. And so just this borders with the you mentioned Rasika in the class, and so Rasika is one who knows is rasagya. He knows rasa, specifically priti, and it simply mentioned that, just like you mentioned that, it's by fortune you're rasika, or one who can taste. But rasagya means gya indicates knowledge, not just that you just got a hint and you have rasa to taste. Rasagya rather implies, to me, my understanding, a cultivation, that there is a knowledge of rasa that has to be cultivated along with the grace of Mahatma. And I was wondering if there's some in Gaudiya Sampradaya, do we have anything like rasa-upasana, cultivation of rasa process, by which you obtain rasa?
We have the Bhakti Rasamrita-sindhuḥ.
No?
Right?
Well, yes. No, I mean anything specific, like specific sadhana that will just be described to practice. Is there anything that...
I mean, that's what the path of Raganuga Bhakti is. What else would it be? I mean, it's defined as, being motivated by the desire that arises from hearing about Bhagavan in the Bhagavatam and these other books that are expressions of Rasika Bhaktas. So the entire path and the adhikar for the path is built upon hearing the expressions of rasikas. And, of the 5 types of sadhana that are said to be most potent, what in the Charitamrita is simply called Bhagavat Shravan, Rupa Goswami calls it Bhagavat Artha Asvadan, or relishing the meaning of Bhagavatam, saha rasikai, with rasikas, as a sadhana. So whether that means reading these poems by such persons, or it means associating with the Vaishnavas who are of such caliber, or the best Vaishnavas one can find, that's the path. That's, Shravan is the prerequisite for any other type of sadhana. Shravan is the means by which the adhikar is acquired, and Shravan is an independently potent practice which can lead to the entire attainment. And Shravan is of what? Shravan is of this poetry and this Bhagavatam, which is for who? Aho Rasika, Bhuvi Bhavuka. The rasikas who are expressing it and who are hearing it. So if this is not, that, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm. No, just the word rasagya just made me think that there is a question of there is rashastragya, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rasagya. There's one who, someone may theoretically understand rasa or just explain priti and madhurya rasa theoretically. Would that have an effect on the listener? That's the question.
Yeah,
Why so?
It might have an effect in the sense that it might transmit some information, which could be useful information, but it might not lead to all that, much of a deep samskar growing in the person if the speaker themselves doesn't have it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, according to the caliber of the cause of the association, the effect of the association will be proportionate.
Mm-hmm. So the rasagya doesn't necessarily mean someone who has rasa, or does it?
Well, when we just discussed all of that, according to Chakravarti Pad, interpreted as a siddha bhakta. So, according to that line of thought, it would. And then, as I showed, Sanatana Gosvami, he also describes a rasika as one who has lobha, or one who's desiring to attain prema, or one who's, qualified as a resolute, one-pointed aspirant.
I see. One who's aspiring, or someone who is okay. Okay. Oh, my pranams. Thank you. It was very nice. I like the introduction you gave, the historical background. Really, it's like you moved there in the past. It's really nice. Amazing, amazing. We have such a great army of scholars in Sampradaya. It's amazing. It just blows my mind, you know?
Yeah, I found it interesting to do, because particularly the 1800s is an area that we don't find all that much information about. You know, we have a lot of research and documentation about the era of the Goswamis, the era of Narottam, Shamananda, Srinivas, and then after that it starts to get murky, and you know, a lot of the texts start to get less reliable, and you know, it becomes harder and harder to be certain about much. And then once you get the printing presses involved, then the end of the 1800s, the 1900s, then we have all this flourishing of scholarship and a lot of information about the scholars and writers who wrote at that time. But you know, the early 1800s, that's an area where, you know, I don't find nearly as much discussion on who were the prominent, you know, leaders in the Gaudiya Vaishnava community in that time, what were, you know, some of the currents of thought of that era. It's harder to trace. So I found it interesting here to research about this Raghunandan Goswami and Viracandra Gosvami and get a little glimpse into the mid-1800s in Bengal among the erudite Gaudiya Vaishnavas of that era.
It would be nice to have some kind of expose of Gaudiya Vaishnava history, just to affirm our, you know, roots.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, some people put out there this kind of like, there was this dark age, and then only when, you know, some people came, then everything became pure again. But you know, if you look into it, you know, I mean, someone like the caliber of these writers, I think it's hard to say that this was just darkness, you know.
Right. So just like one question, because so this Viracandra Gosvami, was he kind of contemporary of Siddha Pandit Baba? Was it?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, Pandit Baba lived into the 1940s. This Viracandra Gosvami passed on in 1885, I think it was.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, so he's a bit earlier.
Yeah, okay, so not much of a connection there. Okay. Yeah, it'd be nice to put all these names, you know. It's so good to understand, actually reveal the history of good life, like, to the eye of commoner. That'd be great. Jagananda Pandit was, you know, Jagananda, like Jagananda. He said his favorite subject is history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. He knew quite a lot, actually.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway.
All right.
Well,
it's getting a little late on my end. I think I'll sign off here.
Yes.
But I look forward to the coming days. There's many delightful expressions that I hope we can joyfully relish together. So, Vaishnavebhyo Namo, Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai.